But let's end the awkwardness and get this going, because I know these guys can talk a lot and we have a short amount of time. So again, my name is Aaron Churchill. I'm the Ohio Research Director for the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, and it's really my pleasure to open up this conversation today about school attendance boundaries, and also interdistrict open enrollment. So today on our event, it's my pleasure to introduce Tim DeRoche, an independent consultant and author of a great book called Fine Line. I have a great copy here, and you can pick up that book at your local bookstore or buy it on Amazon, however you like to buy your books. It's a terrific book, and he'll talk a little bit more about it today. Also on our call this morning is Darrell Bradford, the Executive Vice President of the National Education Reform Group 50 CAN. So we're happy to have Darrell on it. And here in Ohio, we have two local celebrities. One is Greg Lawson, a research fellow at the Buckeye Institute. And also, of course, none other than Chad Aldis, my boss, who is the Vice President for Ohio policy at the Thomas B. Fordham Institute. And I just want to give a special thanks to Greg and the Buckeye Institute for agreeing to co-host this event and helping to promote it. And we're really grateful for the partnership to put this on. So the way this webinar will work structurally is I'll turn it over to Tim first to give a brief summary of his report, not report, I should say, book. Called A Fine Line, that looks at a lot of the history and some of the background about how we got school boundaries, how we got district boundaries, and what are some of the issues with that across the nations. After that, we'll have about a 10-minute panel and responses from Darrell, Greg, and Chad to talk a little bit about the national and local scene on this issue. And then we'll open it up finally for questions from you, the audience. And there's a couple ways you can submit questions. One is through the Q&A that you see on the webinar. The other option, if you would like to talk, we'll be able to have audio. So you can raise your hand, and during the Q&A portion, we'll open up the audio line and you'll be able to ask your question or make a comment if you wish. So with that, I think that's all the introductory material. Again, all the Q&A, you can do it at any time you want through the chat box, or you can wait until the Q&A session toward the end of our meeting today. Okay, so with that, I would love to turn the presentation over to Tim, who's going to talk a little bit more about his book.
Thank you so much, Aaron. Excuse me. Thank you so much, Aaron, and thanks to the Buckeye Institute and the Fordham Institute for hosting. I love the state of Ohio. Have actually done several projects out in Ohio over the last few years, and I've got to know Chad, and have done some other projects in the private sector in Columbus as well. So really appreciate the opportunity to talk about these issues. I've been geeking out about this stuff for the last 5 or 6 years as I worked on this book. The book really got its start out of a spark of curiosity. I have a young family. I live here in Los Angeles. Grew up in Milwaukee, but live out here in Los Angeles. We live in the heart of the LA Unified School District, which is a very large, sprawling district which covers all of the city of Los Angeles and many smaller cities that actually are contiguous with the city of Los Angeles. And what we've been seeing, we have a 6-year-old and a 3-year-old, and what you see in our neighborhood is this fascinating dynamic, and it's probably familiar to many of the viewers. This dynamic of trying to get into the good public schools, right? There's a scarcity of schools that you would call good in the city of Los Angeles. Where the reading proficiency rates are at a level that you would feel comfortable with, and that have generally a good reputation in the community. There's just a scarcity of those. And so there's a lot of talk. My wife lets me peer over her shoulder at the Facebook mom group sometimes. There's a lot of talk about how to get into these good elite public schools. So how do you do that? Well, as many of you know, the way to do that in Los Angeles, as in many other cities, the way to do that is to buy a home, or in less frequent cases, rent an apartment on the right side of an attendance zone boundary for one of these schools. So the way that these schools make determinations about who gets in and who is out are these arbitrarily drawn attendance zone boundaries. They're drawn by bureaucrats in the bowels of the school system, and no one really knows how they're drawn. In many cases, they haven't changed for decades. And what you see is that the houses on the one side of the line, if you've got an elite public school like we do here in our neighborhood, there's a school called Mount Washington Elementary. I'll share a little bit more about Mount Washington Elementary in a second. You know, for a similar home, you're going to pay $200,000 more for a house on the right side of the line versus the wrong side of the line. So you've got extreme distortions in the real estate market. You've got a lot of anxiety amongst young parents about how to get access to this great public school. And actually, maybe now's a good time to talk about it. I can bring up, I'm going to share my screen here. All right, can everybody see that? Good, good, good. So just a quick glamour shot of the book. I appreciate Aaron sharing the book. So let's go here. So this is a map of our neighborhood in Los Angeles. And what you can see is the red school is the school I was just talking about, Mount Washington Elementary. They've got over 75% reading proficiency at that school, and they're about 60% white. And then you see the surrounding 7 public elementary schools. The largest percentage of white students at any one of those surrounding schools is 9%, right? So you have a very high concentration of the white families going to this elite school, Mount Washington. The surrounding schools largely serve people of color and immigrants. And what you see is very, very stark disparities in performance, right? The Mount Washington has those reading proficiency rates above 75%. All the surrounding schools are well below that. A couple of them are down near 16%. So very, very stark disparities. And what determines whether or not you get into Mount Washington is that red dotted line, right? That red dotted line, which is the attendance zone drawn by the district. Now, all of the folks on this map are constituents of the Los Angeles Unified School District. They pay into the district. They pay for the bonds of the district that pay for new schools and renovations of the schools. So everyone on this map is paying for Mount Washington Elementary. The only folks who are allowed to go are the people within the red dotted line. So we already have a name for this thing, right? This idea that you would use a map and you would draw lines on the map to determine who is and isn't eligible for valuable government services. We have a name for that. It's called redlining. So let's go to the next page. This is a redlining map. I think this one's from Chicago, if I remember correctly. And basically, these were maps drawn in the 1930s by the Roosevelt administration. There was an agency called the Homeowners Loan Corporation. And during the New Deal, there were all sorts of new federal housing assistance programs. And these maps were used to determine who was eligible and who wasn't. The blue and green areas, the desirable areas of the city, people who live there were eligible for this assistance. The people in the red and the yellow areas were not. And those areas were deemed undesirable in the case of yellow and hazardous in the case of red. And what you see is that the yellow and the red areas were the areas of the city with large numbers of people of color, especially African Americans and immigrants, right? And so redlining is well known as a dark stain on our nation's past. And what I always point out to people, we still have it, right? We still have it. It's just in a different form, and it's the school zones. And the school zones, they drive where people live, right? The reason wealthy people congregate on the one side of the line is they get access to this school. And so it enhances the racial and the income divisions in our society. And I think it's very harmful for the social compact. So page 4, this is just overlaying the Mount Washington attendance zone that you saw on the previous page over the redlining map from Los Angeles from this period. And what you can see is that the zone largely replicates the quote unquote desirable area of this neighborhood from 90 years ago, from the redlining map of 90 years ago, which was explicitly created for racial discrimination and segregation. And you can see that the red and the yellow areas of the map, right, are still, right, those areas are still the areas that are largely, there's a disproportionate number of ethnic minorities, people of color, and immigrants. And so they are still excluded from this elite public school. So my question when I started this book was, is this something that's unique to Los Angeles, or is this something that goes on across the country? And we learned pretty quick this goes on in almost every major city, right? And so I'll bring up an Ohio example. So these are the attendance zones for Clinton Elementary and Como Elementary in the city of Columbus. And what you can see is that the dividing line, the attendance zone boundary that determines who is and isn't eligible to attend Clinton Elementary, which is the high-performing elite school, runs right along the railroad tracks, right? So it's a straight line. If you're on one side, so in Columbus, it really is, do you live on the right side of the tracks or do you live on the wrong side of the tracks? And, you know, this isn't people making these decisions, right? About, oh, I'm going to live here to get, you know, like these aren't individual, this is the government drawing a line and saying, you get access to the good school, you don't, right? So let's just look at the stats for those two schools. These are schools that serve the same neighborhood, right? Como Elementary is 100% low income, 100% low income. And Clinton Elementary is 22% income. So very, very stark demographic disparities. Now, I'll bet if you picked, I did this in Chicago, I looked at 2 health clinics on 2 sides of the line. The health clinics did not have vastly disparate ratings on Google, right? Because when you pick a health clinic, you can go wherever you want. You can cross the railroad tracks, you can cross North Avenue, you can cross whatever street you want when you pick a healthcare clinic. But you can't do that when you pick schools. The government is keeping us segregated with these lines. And so what that results in is very, very stark disparities in demographics and in student achievement, right? So here you've got the percent proficient for the last year that was available. I think in Ohio when I published the book, when we went to press, I think the last available date was 2018. But you can see that the reading proficiency and math proficiency above 80% for Clinton, below 50% for Como. So very stark disparities in demographics, but also very stark disparities in performance and student performance. And that's not to say that every kid from Como, if you put them in Clinton, they're suddenly, 90% are going to be proficient. That's not the point. The point is that this kind of division is damaging to the social compact and probably not good for those kids. Like, is it really best to keep the most challenged kids segregated in these underperforming schools and keeping them out of schools that they live within walking distance of? So you can see, I'll finish up here soon, but you can see that this is all over the place. This is the Chicago example I gave. Very, very stark disparities in Chicago. Here's one in Brooklyn, right? Very, very stark disparities between 2 schools that are right next to each other. And in Brooklyn, you've got the redlining map. Now, the redlining map doesn't match up in all cases with the attendance zone. The redlining map from the 30s doesn't match up, but it doesn't, it's kind of the exception that proves the rule, right? Like in some cases, the demographics of different neighborhoods have changed over time. And what has happened is that the attendance zone boundary has changed to match the demographic changes of the neighborhood. So these lines are being used either consciously or unconsciously to keep populations of Americans separate from each other. So with that, I'll leave it. I'd love to hear the other panelists, and I'll go on mute and I'll stop sharing.
Okay, so thank you, Tim, for a very short description of your book. The book gets into a lot more things that we can definitely get into in the next half hour if we can't have the time. The book itself is fantastic in the sense that the maps themselves are worth purchasing the book to take a look at it. I want to start our panel discussion with a couple questions, one for Tim and then one for Darrell. So Tim, I'll start with you. Tell us a little bit more about the reaction to your book, and have people sort of gotten the point that this is inherently unfair to separate students and families in this sort of way, and do you think people are getting the idea that you're trying to drive home in your book, and what are you seeing?
Yeah, no, I've been very pleased. Like, I think this resonates with folks. I think this is something that's a part of the fabric of society in America, and we all know it, right? In talking about the book over the last 5 years at cocktail parties, everyone has a story about lying about your address, right? Or trying to buy a home on the right side of the line, right? And so it resonates with parents. It resonates with Americans up and down the income scale, right? Like people lie about their address no matter how much money they have. I talked to a wealthy white mom in Malibu who bought their neighbor's gas bill to get their kid into Santa Monica High School in Los Angeles. Those are both wealthy areas, but they thought that Santa Monica was a better fit and they weren't going to change where they lived. So I think it resonates with folks. I think the parent stories in the book resonate with folks. And I think the other thing that resonates is the redlining thing. We have not talked about that as folks involved in school reform. We have not talked very much about the comparisons to redlining. And obviously it was an incredible epiphany moment when I was sitting in my little office trying to line up that old redlining map with the current day attendance zone. The first one I did was Ivanhoe Elementary here in LA, which is a few miles away from us. But my eyes got wider and wider as I saw what was going on, and to be honest, I was a little surprised nobody had done that before. After I thought of it, it sort of seemed like a no-brainer that we hadn't tried that before, and I think it drives home the point that especially for folks on the left who have sort of a knee-jerk reaction against school choice and who have a knee-jerk reaction to keep kids in this, go to your local public school. Those folks have an intuitive, they know they're against redlining, right? And when I point out the similarities between redlining and these attendance zones, I do think it has changed the dynamic of the nature of conversations I've had with folks out here in Los Angeles who would normally be very supportive of the educational establishment and the existing traditional public school system. When you point out the redlining thing, it really does make a material difference in how they think about it, because we all know that redlining was wrong. Of course it was wrong. And I think when we see the similarities between those policies and these policies, I think it helps us see something that's been in front of us all the time, but that's been hard. It's such a part of the fabric of our lives. It's the water, right? We can't, what water, right? It's just, we have a hard time seeing it because it's just so fundamental to our lives. So yeah, thanks. I appreciate that.
Yeah, and there's a great story in your book, Tim, about I think it's your cousin or maybe your aunt and uncle that had two kids, and their district of residence worked for one of them, but it didn't work for the other, and they're trying to get into a school right across the district line, and it's a very difficult thing for them to do. So that's a very powerful story about how district lines can really hinder choice and really hinder families finding the best option for their own kids. Darrell, I want to turn it over to you for a second. So you spoke pretty passionately about this issue about educational redlining. There's actually a terrific video out there. It's probably somewhere on YouTube. You can look it up if you're out there. But you've definitely been outspoken on this issue and some of the injustice. So what, in your view, why is it such a problem? And do you see anything happening in the advocacy area to try to, either weaken the link between zip code and school attendance or try to get rid of it? So I want to turn it over to you to get your thoughts.
So I'd like to thank the Thomas B. Fordham Institute and the Buckeye Institute for having me. And I'd like to thank Aaron for being my hype man. Thank you very much. I appreciate that too. Tim knows this. I gave a talk actually in Akron last year. And in thinking about my own schooling experience growing up in Baltimore, I engaged in the exercise of plotting every place I'd gone to school against the Baltimore redlining map. And it turned out that over time, so the first school I went to was the only school I ever went to that I was zoned for. And it turned out that as I went to progressively better schools, they were located in areas that were, that were green, right? that were blue or green on the map. And it was just, it was incredibly, and then the last one was like so good and so far there wasn't even a color for it, right? I went to like an independent K-12 day school that was about 8 miles outside of Baltimore, and so that was just like incredibly telling for me as a person who like works on policies that are meant to decouple where you live from where you go to school. Like even for me, that was striking. And just kind of to build on Tim's point and maybe to talk about how I view the problem now. So there are lots of policies that people are like, this is a racist policy. And I normally don't jump out on that. However, this is a racist set of policies, right? I mean, like the history of this set is sort of like unimpeachable, and so it really has in viewing like racial disparities, racial divisions, racial impacts, like and how that how that is sort of like metastasized over the last like 80 years. It is it's difficult to stand up for the root system, which is like we're going to segregate America, we're going to color code it, we're going to give some people mortgages and other people no mortgages, we're going to design school finance mechanisms and assignment mechanisms that lay right on top of that, and then we're going to champion the neighborhood school, right? And that just doesn't work, right? Like if you pull that thread through history, much as Tim said about the social compact, that's not who we want to be as a nation, right? Like that system does not meet our aspirations as Americans, I think. So I just want to throw that out there. I think it's really important to consider. In terms of like thinking about it, what I think is important is to get that this is a problem. It's a problem of scarcity, as we sort of heard earlier, and it actually impacts lots of people at the same time negatively, but in different ways. So, for instance, right, if you're zoned to Como, or if you're zoned to Harlem Park in Southwest Baltimore, where I was zoned to, where we were always having conversations, or my mom and my grandmother having conversations about whose address we were going to use so I could go, to some other school. And this is like way back in the day before anybody was talking about this stuff this way. That's one way that this set of policies has a negative impact on Americans, and in this case, like African Americans or lower income Americans of color, right? If you are a young, just fresh out of the box family without a lot of capital, the fact that you are buying into a bid up housing market to get school that's supposed to be free is another way that this set of policies has a negative effect on people, right? If you have the money, but you have to make a bet on a kid you don't even have yet, right? Kids. I know Chad's got more than one of them, right? Like kids are different, and you don't necessarily know whether or not the best school is the best school for them, right? Even if the data bear that out, right? And so you make it, and that's a bad policy, right? You're trapped in that too. And so I look at this paradigm, and this paradigm is bad across many verticals, right? And the thing that I think you can point to most specifically about it, and I'll stop. It's just that because it's a paradigm of scarcity, it has no focus on new school creation, right? It reduces the entire discussion down to, you have good school, give me yours, instead of how do I get mine? Like, what systems of governance or movement or finance are available so I can get the education that is right for me, which is frankly where I think we should be going. And with a year's worth of more than a year's worth of disrupted learning all across the country, I think many more people have an appetite for an approach that is like that. And I'd be happy to talk about it some more later.
Great. So I think we've laid out the problems pretty well with some of the school assignments based on where families and kids live. And so now I'll bring in the Ohio policy think tankers to give us the solution, right? Because that's what we do. We think about solutions. So Greg, I'll start with you. Talk about how you or the Buckeye Institute are thinking about, ways where we can sort of, like Darrell said, decouple the link between kids' zip codes and where they attend schools. What are some of the policy discussions happening in Columbus about how to, enable and empower families to get the education that they think their kids deserve,
Sure.
rather than the one that they're assigned to?
Well, I think the first thing is Ohio is an interesting state because we do have, in theory, a lot of school choice options between 5 different voucher programs, charter schools. But I think one of the challenges you still run into is that there is still stovepiping of funding in a sense. And there's a lot of mechanisms in the school funding, well, quasi formula, whatever you want to call it, what we have today, that create major problems. And really, I think the way you have to deal with this is you have to break down silos, and you have to have money essentially following the student. And this isn't easier said than done when you have a complicated school funding system like we have in Ohio, where you have state spending and local spending, and we're a local control state, and there's a certain things that have constitutional provisions there and questions, but how do you have the funding? I mean, money should be fungible. And I think that is the first thing. We also have an interesting development here in Ohio where we have open enrollment issues, which doesn't get quite to the internal to the school district, but definitely deals with what happens across district boundaries. And I think Fordham in particular has done some really excellent work on looking at, you have almost 80% of school districts in Ohio technically have open enrollment. However, of those districts that do not, the overwhelming majority of those are suburban school districts. And while there may be, in some cases, some legitimate space issues and things because of landlocked districts and things like that, it is a problem, and it is a very significant problem. And we need to break that boundary down so that it's not there. But I think broader, we need to think about things, something the Buckeye Institute, something I've written about a lot, and I've worked with some folks in DC, and we've talked with folks at Fordham and other school choice advocates, is the notion of things like education savings accounts, because these are, they're happening in other states. Arizona has them. West Virginia, our neighbor, just passed a very ambitious education savings account plan. And what these do is they take vouchers and they really take them to the next level. They go beyond just tuition, and they have flexibility in how spending can occur so that you can procure not just what building you go to, whether it's another traditional public building, whether it's a charter school, whether it's a private school, but it also allows you to have dollars where you can choose tutors, other curriculum supports and things like that, which, especially in the disruption era that we're in, due to COVID and things like that, could be extremely helpful to students, especially students who have already had gaps, achievement gaps, and things like that, and how do we get the kind of services that an individual student needs? And that's where we're getting down to. It's got to be the individual student. And the only way to do that is to have flexibility and fungibility of funding. And an education savings account is a mechanism through which you can start to do that. So I think it was mentioned earlier here today, you may have, you've got 3 kids, 2 of them might be perfectly doing very well and happy where they're at, and doing very well, but the 3rd one isn't. And that can be whether it's an academic issue, whether it's a bullying issue, whether it's any of these things. Shouldn't they have the ability to do something else as well, and it not be solely contingent upon the fact that you made the right bet on the kids that you didn't have when you first moved somewhere? And I think this is something that we're starting to really talk a lot about from the Buckeye Institute's perspective. I think some of our other friends here in Ohio are doing more to talk about this. And I think we have an opportunity even in this budget cycle with state lawmakers. We have a revamp of the school funding system is on the table. And it's coming at a particularly unique moment in time where we have some particularly unique political stars aligning in Ohio, but we're also coming out of the darkness of the COVID environment too. So this is a time to really have this conversation. And I think that talking about these historical legacies and the problems that these legacies have, let's talk about how we can undo these things. We talk a lot about social justice now. And I think that there is a lot of movement to try to address things that have happened that are not right. This done right is an opportunity to address that in one of the most profound ways imaginable at the individual student level, which is the way we're really going to have to build up. And so I would say that education savings accounts, and there's a whole bunch of technicalities about that, and we can talk about that if folks have interest, but that concept, I think, is the way that you really break down these silos of spending and get money attached to individual kids.
That's great, Greg. There's a question in the chat box, and if the audience wants to, start, putting questions in the chat box or raising their hands, we can start taking those questions. But Greg, there's a question in the chat box I see about homeschooling and whether that is included in the Ohio proposal, and I'm assuming that's having to do with the ESA proposal that you're referring to. So can you talk a little bit about whether homeschooling parents would benefit from the ESA?
Sure. Thanks. In theory, yes. And I think this is a choice. The question is also about who wants to do it. There will be some homeschoolers who I imagine may not want to do that for a variety of reasons, and they should not have to do that. They certainly shouldn't be compelled to do that. But if they want to avail themselves of resources, they should have the option to do so. Of course, whenever you do that, you got to be a little careful because there's going to be some kind of a string attached. The question is how many strings and what are those strings? And that's why you need to make sure that families have the choice to not have to, bind themselves to that if they don't want to. But it certainly should be available to those who, with their eyes wide open, go into a situation and want to avail themselves of it.
Do you want to say something about that, Darrell? I saw some hand motioning.
No, I'm just, it's interesting. So I'm a homeschool supporter, right? I've been schooling myself at home for like a year now. But I understand that the community, like just sort of writ large, is of 2 minds on optional proposals that provide educational resources in the form of dollars, and I think every homeschooling family that wants to participate should be allowed to participate, and that nobody who doesn't want to should have to. And because a lot of people are like, I don't want to. And I think we like the homeschool lobby, in my experience, it is a very passionate and well-organized lobby, right? So I'm glad they're doing what they're doing. But and sometimes like the people who are like, we don't want it, they just kill it for everybody, right? So said with respect, with all respect, I'm not a homeschool hater. So yeah, I think optionality is vital because without optionality in lots of states, these programs, they go sideways for everybody because homeschool families are concerned about these additional regulations.
All right, so I want to bring in Chad to the conversation. He's been sitting here patiently. One thing Greg mentioned was interdistrict open enrollment as a possibility, as a potential solution to try to deal with some of the boundary issues that parents have and families have in terms of accessing good schools. So talk a little bit more about Ohio's interdistrict open enrollment program, and why do you think it's so important, and do you think it'll keep growing as an option for kids and parents?
Thanks, Aaron. Hey, what a great discussion, guys. Thank you all for being here. I think these are raising some really important issues. Greg touched on open enrollment somewhat, so I'm going to be very brief because I know there's questions here and I want to make sure we get to it and we satisfy our audience. You know, that's always got to be the goal of these things. So on interdistrict open enrollment, as Greg said, 80% of districts already participate in it. The most frustrating thing to me is many of the high performing suburban districts near our urban areas are the one that say thanks, but no thanks, and keep their doors closed to mostly low income kids and largely students of color. At a time when we're trying to push boundaries, as we're trying to make up for things in the past that we should be trying to make up for, this is the time more than ever we need to extend opportunities. And I had an opportunity to speak with a school board member of a high wealth suburban district about this, and just nudging them to the person to support open enrollment. And the response was very telling. Because of the partnership in state funding between local and state dollars, the concept was that we would lose money if we took students because we spend $10,000 per kid, and the kid would only come under the state formula with $6,000. And it's frustrating because it's such a fundamental misunderstanding, of the marginal cost of educating one additional child. Your fixed costs are paid for, your classroom's there, your lights are on, the teacher's in the classroom, there's an empty desk. If that empty desk costs you $12,000 to fill, you're doing math wrong. So 6,000 keeps you off the ballot, keeps you from going to ask for levies and asking your supporters for more money, and it helps extend opportunities to what you certainly are billed as a great public school. So open the doors up, share opportunity. So that's sort of my thing. And that's what we're fighting against. We're fighting against not only misunderstandings like the one I just described, but also entrenched property interests. And, Tim talked about very well about the concept of redlining and how when people realize, and it's really put in their face and they can't run from it, then there's an acknowledgement that this isn't cool. But it's not going to stop them from buying real estate in those very zones to get their kids into Clinton Elementary, right? So we've got to acknowledge that it's tough. It's going to take political leadership at the school district level, which is really hard to do if you've worked with a lot of school board leaders to get to the next stage. Now, after taking way more than my time already, even though I said I'd be short, I'll just drop it off there and hopefully we can get to some questions.
All right, yeah, we have a couple questions. Please keep them coming if you have them. We have a question from Theta Sampson, and this one is for Tim. So Tim, you established a great nexus between enrollment and the real estate market, including the desire of families to attend schools in areas with good schools that typically happen to be in expensive real estate markets. So judging from the current overheated real estate market, the urgency to find realistic opportunities for these families becomes even more urgent. So this is a question. Here's the question. So what are your thoughts on rent control and other affordable housing initiatives like tax credits are making some positive impact on the redlining issue? So a little bit outside education, but you do talk a lot about the real estate issues and especially young families having to deal with buying into expensive marketplaces to get a good school.
It is a great question. And I think that our governments over the past 15 years to 20 years have shown a big interest in propping up home values, right? And I would say driving up home values. And it's the same thing with the stock market, right? Our leaders face incentives and have gone down a path of driving up the prices of assets. And that is not what we want as a community. That is not what we want as Americans, right? As a homeowner, I'm thrilled, right, that the government is insistent that the price of my home, the value of my home go up over time. And they are willing to go to extraordinary lengths to drive up the price of my home. Unfortunately, as a parent, and I think of myself as a parent first and a homeowner second, as a parent, I don't want my children living in a country where you have to be extremely wealthy to afford a basic home for a young family. That I don't want that. And I don't want that for any American family. We should want housing to be affordable, and we should elect leaders who engage in policies that help make housing affordable. So I'm not a huge fan of rent control, because I think what you see in places with rent control is that the supply dries up, right? It drives down supply. And so what you get is for any one person who's already in an apartment, when the rent control passes, it's great because it keeps them at an under market rate, but it provides a long-term incentive for folks not to rent out their housing. And it restricts the housing stock, and therefore you end up with a bigger problem over time. And I think you see that in places with big rent control statutes like New York City. We have one here that's a little less restrictive in Los Angeles. I think the problems of increasing rent here are a very big deal. Tax credits and things like that for low-income housing, I'm more open on that one, and I think depends on the particulars. I'm not an expert on those types of policies, but I think those have there's more promise there. I am a big fan of reducing restrictive zoning. So what you see, I brought up earlier that if for an equivalent house on one side of the line versus the other side of the line, you may pay $200,000 more to live in the Mount Washington zone in my neighborhood. Well, that's on top of the fact that the houses in that zone are already more expensive, right? Because the zone encompasses a neighborhood that has been zoned, planning zoned, not school district zones, but planning zoned by the city to be single family homes with large lots. These are typically larger homes. So your average home, even before the distortion of the attendance zone, the average home in that attendance zone is higher. When you layer the attendance zone on it, it becomes even more higher. And so generally, I'm in favor of reducing that restrictive zoning, making it easier to build in the city centers. Here in Los Angeles, very hard to build unless you are a very wealthy developer. And those folks are often, creating high rises for wealthy foreigners to buy a condo in Los Angeles. It's not for young families. And then, other things at the federal level, I think would help mitigate the distortions in our real estate market that are currently driving up housing prices. That's a long answer, but that's what I got.
Got into a lot of things.
Can I give a quick addendum?
Real
Because
quick.
it's not a retort. As a recovering Manhattanite, I can affirm the rent control scarcity thing. So I want to hold it down. But I do think that we have to be really careful, because it's like the problem of school zoning and housing scarcity caused by restrictive zoning, restrictive covenants, whatever, is like it's intimate, right? And the overlap is almost 100%, but it's not 100%. And I think there are different policy actions if you want to work on a challenge of school scarcity than if you want to work on a challenge of an overheated housing market. And like in my estimation, most of the time, governments, advocates, or whatever want to solve the education problem with a housing solution, right? And these are just two different things. So I want to, like, they look incredibly similar, but I would just urge everybody to remember that there are different tools in the toolbox that need to be used to resolve these things to appropriate outcomes.
Greg, you get 30 seconds because we have a couple questions.
I think what Darrell said is really good, and I think this gets to back to sort of the point that I was raising about the fungibility of funding. It is an element of this, because we all, by doing that and you're going to be able to create a broader marketplace for the provision of services than what you have now when everything is as stovepiped as it is. And that, I think, is going to be critically important too, because the more providers there are of whatever type they are, the more you can get outside of there being a school that's directly in one of these kind of essentially zoned areas and things like that. So I think the key is to be able to have much more the flexibility of funding on the per student basis. And that may eventually require some uncomfortable conversations about how state and local dollars work, and what should be considered a state dollar and what's a local dollar, and things of that nature as well. That opens up a Pandora's box on one hand, but we have to have these kind of conversations because there's a lot of money that we need to have access to be able to allow for that flexibility to maximize its opportunity to create the multiple providers that we want, so that students then have the choices that we really want for all different kinds of students.
Well, we're running out of time, and I want to get to a couple questions, and we'll have to keep them brief. So one is from Andrew Show, and he raised his hand. So can we open up his audio line? There we go. Okay, you're on.
All right. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. I'm a residential real estate buyer broker for 30 years here in Columbus, actually 29 years. And I have relocating buyers all the time that say anywhere but Columbus City schools. Now, I will tell you this, if you want to talk about redlining, which I disagree with your definition of redlining, read Richard Rothstein's The Color of Law. Redlining and the restrictive covenants and so forth against Blacks and minorities and so forth was done by our government, and deed restrictions, not by real estate people per se, but it was done by the government. And so when we talk about redlining, we're talking about financing for lending purposes. But let me get to my core issue here. Back in 1972, I graduated from Columbus Whetstone High School. We had 114,000 students in the district. Columbus, along with Upper Arlington, Bexley, and Worthington, were arguably the 4 best districts in Central Ohio. The other suburban districts were second-tier districts, okay? And so what happened? In '79, the courts ruled that the funding was bad because they gave the new schools all the new stuff, and the old legacy schools did not get the new stuff. And the teachers' unions were able to get the teachers with seniority to go to pick where they wanted to go teach, and they wanted to teach in the new buildings. So the courts ruled that that was unfair, and the solution was to make every school racially the same composition of 12% Black. We went from a district of 115,000 students in the mid-'70s down to a district now of 50,000 students, and 17,000 students opt out of Columbus schools to go to private, charter, online, homeschool, whatever, okay? So my thing is this. Ralph Johnson, who's recently passed away, was the superintendent of New Albany High School, or New Albany schools here in the metro area, arguably one of the best performing districts in the state. He told me, he said, forced busing has been the single biggest tragedy in urban education in the United States. This is not an issue for suburban schools. This is not an issue for suburban schools at all. It is strictly urban districts. So when you look at Columbus, when they went into forced busing, there was this exodus out. So now you have a more racially identifiable, fiscally poor, physically poor district than ever before. And I served on the Columbus Schools Ad Hoc Facilities Committee 4 years ago. I've served on the New Albany Schools Finance Committees and Levy Committees and so forth. And what I'm suggesting to you is that if you go through with this idea of school choice, which we already have, but now you want to say, well, let's let the suburban districts take in other people, they can't keep up with the growth that they've got. New Albany actually had a point where they actually hired a company to ferret out the people that were illegally putting their kids in the New Albany schools. And during the school year, those students just disappeared because they were caught. So remember that zip codes do not match up with municipal codes, which do not match up with school districts. And I want to go back to the concept of neighborhood schools. And why is it that we have some public schools here in Columbus that are considered great, and some that are considered average, and some that are considered very poor? And if you don't get your kid in the lottery to the right school, there's a precipitous drop off in enrollment between 5th grade elementary and 6th grade middle school. So I think it's like the comedian who says, you know, the scientist looks at a frog, tells the frog to jump, and the frog jumps, he cuts off one leg and the frog sort of jumps. And then he cuts off the second leg and he tells the frog to jump, and the frog doesn't jump. And he puts in his book, conclusion: frogs cannot hear with both legs cut off. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Andrew, for the comments and the questions. Does anybody want to respond very quickly? We'll go probably until about noon, and then we'll have to hop off. But I'll let anybody respond very quickly among our panelists.
I guess one of the things that I would say is I understand the argument that some of the suburban areas are already having mass, they're having significant enrollments. There are going to be some constraints relative to the kind of buildings that can be built and things like that. What I think the reason why the greater flexibility on funding, I think, is so important, is so that the money can go. I mean, does a kid necessarily have to go to Olentangy or New Albany or those, or could they procure services at the private school or a good charter? I was on a school board in my private capacity that was one of the higher performing public school buildings in the state, Columbus Preparatory Academy here in Columbus. It was a charter school, but it did very, very well in comparison to other public schools, and certainly even other charter schools and everything else. I think what you will see is you can see a market develop over time when funding is allowed to go, and people will see the opportunities there. Right now, there are less opportunities. We don't have very many classical academies. Whether you're for those, not for those, it's hard to create these things. Even with the charter schools and stuff like that, it's very difficult to get the funding to get these things off the ground. If you had more ability to have money going where students wanted to go, you could create critical masses to create, and enterprising folks will create the ability to have schools that will attract those students. So I think that we're still stuck a little bit in a mindset of this is how a system works. My suggestion is that we get away from systems and we get to the real concept. And I mean, it's a little of a kitschy, cliche phrase, but students first. And I think that is the key, is to think about how we do that so that it's not wedded to an antiquated system that is being put together with bubble gum and masking tape, and there's a tweak here and there's a tweak there and there's this issue because of that. We have to kind of blow that up. I mean, we have a situation in America where you can choose whatever entertainment you want. I've got Roku, so if you want HBO Max and ESPN and all your individual channels, we expect that, we demand that. There's cord cutters out the wazoo these days who are getting away from cable, and cable's having to create a platform where they can then have individual channels because people like to do that. Well, why aren't we able to do more of that for education so that it's meeting the individualized needs? So I think, again, it's about having the flexibility so that we can create markets so that there are students who will be able to do this. And it's not about just being able to go into New Albany or to any of these other individual districts that we think of as the high performing districts. There may be schools that aren't even built yet, aren't even conceived of yet, because there's no funding mechanism to create them. Why shouldn't we be able to create those opportunities that will meet the needs of some group of students?
Hey, Aaron, can I kind of hop on this next question, because I think it's a good one, and Chad, please feel free to shout me down as an outsider. Just to be reductive about it, like so much of this, whether or not you want to assemble your education or whether or not you're just trying to find a seat in the right school, is a question of school finance, right? And the modernization and flexibility of school finance in ways that reduce the friction of place and assignment, right? And the generation of wealth for school districts, kind of to this single corner. And so I would just encourage everyone, especially if in your state you were talking about school modernizing your school finance arrangements, to look at the big bucket of money that just fell out of the sky from DC, and think about how you can use that money in some productive way to update your formula so that it is closer to the kind of relationship we want people to have with schools and choosing than a formula that is based on residential assignment and local property wealth. So that would just be my advice to kind of to Michael Goodman's question as well.
Yeah, Michael Goodman has a question about regional disparities in Ohio as far as the wealth of school districts. And there are, of course, variations from district to district on how wealthy they are in terms of real estate and income. The state, of course, does a lot in terms of trying to equalize funding across districts through the school funding formula. And that's why the formula is so critical. The last question I want to throw out there, and then we'll wrap things up, is how do you solve the levy issue? So this is a question about local taxes, and we have to be brief. What would stop people from living in a low property tax area and instead attend a high property tax school? So I'll let maybe Chad wants to jump in, and then I'll let Tim get the final word on the question about tax values, and then we'll wrap things up.
Yeah. If Ohio is going to change, the link between how we look at state and local taxes will need to be adjusted. So it's going to have to be something that lawmakers, policymakers agree on and sort of come together on. There was already a proposal a couple years ago by State Senator Andy Brenner that would have brought local property taxes in the same amount from everywhere in terms of as a percentage of property value into the state and then be redistributed equitably. But let's be clear, people don't want school funding dollars redistributed equitably according to the needs. So this is a battle we're going to continue to face. The current structure, as I described it, of our open enrollment policy, for instance, if open enrollment was mandated, because of the marginal cost of education, and because almost every district, probably 90% of districts are sitting with some open seats, could do a lot toward breaking down those barriers and could be a great incremental first step until the appetite was there more widely for widespread changes to local property taxes versus state property taxes and making it about education funding. I think it's going to come bit by bit, piece by piece, but it is possible to do. It's just it's a mouthful and it's tough to do. So, but you know, we're going to have to find steps at a time. Money being more fungible, following the child, and potentially things like mandatory statewide open enrollment could be good steps.